Ladies and gentlemen, hello and very welcome to this seminar here at the European Policy Center in Brussels. My name is Göran von Sydow. I'm the director of SIEPS, the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies. And we are very pleased that we could have this cooperation with the EPC, organizing a number of events during the Swedish presidency. And this is the final event because it's also the final week of the Swedish presidency. So now it's the moment to take stock of what the Swedes have achieved and perhaps where they have not advanced as much, where one could think. And we will talk about this during the next hour and a quarter. And you are very welcome here, participants here in the room. And of course, also you following this seminar online, very welcome. Now, we find ourselves in a difficult context with, of course, the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. And that has, of course, set the parameters and the frame for the Swedish EU presidency. But not only that has been at the hands of the Swedes, but also a very rich agenda full of legislative files that are progressing or have been concluded. The Swedish EU presidency, before taking up its task, it launched four broad priorities to guide their work. Of course, the first one being security and maintaining European unity. The second one dealing more with the economy and competitiveness. As we also know, Europe has to face to global competition and challenges in this field. Third one, naturally, being the Green Deal. And then the final priority, that of democracy and rule of law. And I'm sure we will be able to touch upon all of these areas during these conversations here today. The format is pretty straightforward. I'm very happy that we have here with us today the Minister for EU Affairs from Sweden, and she will, Jessika Roswall, and she will deliver an introductory speech outlining her view on what has been achieved so far. After the speech, we will have a panel consisting of three eminent analysts, Elizabeth Kuiper from the European Policy Center, Andreas Liljeheden, who is the correspondent for Swedish Public Broadcasting here in Brussels, and then Ignacio Molina, who is an analyst from the Elcano Institute in Madrid. As you know, Spain is taking over in just a week, so we will be very curious to hear also from Ignacio about those prospects. There will be room for questions and answers and comments from you here, but also from those of you following this seminar online. So you just write your questions in the Q&A box, and I will try to pick them up here. When the seminar is concluded, there is a lunch buffet served outside, so please stay for that as well. Now that's the end of this introduction, and I'm now very happy to welcome Jessika Roswall, Minister for EU Affairs from Sweden, to give her speech.
Thank you, Göran, and thank you, EPC and SIEPS for organizing this discussion. And I plan to touch on the priorities that you pointed out, Göran. But let me start with saying something that you probably will not be surprised that I say. I think that Swedish presidency has been successful. Yeah, I know that. I would like to say also that when we planned this presidency, we decided on the few areas, main priorities that Göran also pointed out. And when we now summarize these 6 months, we can check in almost every box. Yes, we did have had some criticism for not organizing concerts and other pomps and circumstances, but I am confident that we made the right priority. Our priorities were relevant given the political context, and we delivered. So let me say something about each of these. My government is overriding vision is safer, greener, and freer Europe. And that goes also for the EU presidencies as well as EU policy in general. And this vision is a response to the fact that we are in the middle of some major transition. Following Russia's unlawful and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, we are witnessing the return of geopolitical in a way that we haven't seen for decades. And we are experiencing how democratic principles, ones that we have been taking for granted for a long time, are being challenged in the Union and in our neighborhood. In parallel, we are facing economic challenges with stagnation growth figures and high inflation. And at the same time, we must continue taking resolute actions to combat climate change. And I think that we all sense the need for credible policy responses. And let me say a few words about what we have been done since January, and also what our Spanish friends will inherit in the next week. Starting with security. Russia's war against Ukraine is brutal and unforgivable. Russian missile strikes continue to hit residential buildings and civilians. Thousands have been killed, families have been broken. The recent destruction of the Kakhovka Dam is yet another demonstration of the brutality of the Russian aggression. At the same time, it has been very clear that during this past 1.5 years, Russia is weakened. The people of Ukraine are fighting Europe's freedom with enormous courage. The EU has a vital role to play in the continuing support to Ukraine and its people. And from day one, from the Swedish presidency, this has been our top priority, to keep pressure on Russian regime and to maintain the strength and European unity that the Union has shown. We have united the 27 EU member states behind the 10th package of sanctions against Russia, and last week, in additional package number 11. We have agreed to deliver 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine, and we have also taken the initiative to use frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine recovery. And during our presidency, the International Center for Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine has become ready to start in operation, and it will open in The Hague in just a week's time. Ukraine has our support and the support of Europe morally, economically, politically, and militarily. Making Europe safer is also about getting our own house in order. And a few weeks ago, we achieved something that many maybe didn't believe it was impossible: an agreement on the two of most central pieces of the legislation in the Migration Pact. One on solidarity and the sharing of responsibilities between member states, and an efficient, uniform, and simplified process for asylum management. And I remember the early days of our presidency, where very few were optimistic about our chances. And I got a lot of questions, and my speaking points was always that we are sticking to the timetable. But at the same time, we were, of course, working very hard to find the way forward. And eventually, a compromise could take form. But anyone in politics will tell you that finding that compromise is not enough. You also have to sell it. And you have to have a minister also ready to stay up all night, as Maria Malmö Stenergard said, to make it happen. And here I also would like to take the opportunity to special thank also the Perm rep who did our Perm rep who did an excellent job in finding the fine-tuning on the details to make sure that we have everybody on board. The Council's decision on constitution important and long-awaited leap forwards a fair and uniform migration system. And when we look back on the Swedish presidency, I'm sure that this will be seen as one of our major achievements. During the spring, several negotiations have also been completed to combat organized crime. We have strengthened EU cooperation so that illegal weapons cannot enter the country. We have made it easier to find criminal proceeds that have been hidden and moved between different EU countries, and to freeze and confiscate criminals' assets. And steps has also been taken to better use digital tools to enable a quick and secure exchange of information between member states and judicial authorities. In parallel, we are taking important steps to combat climate change, make Europe greener, and to create the right conditions for European industry to lead the green transition. The world's most ambitious climate package, Fit for 55, has now been completed. This is quite an achievement, considering that it was just 2 years ago that the package was tabled. And as you know, we have had few bumps on the road. And also significant achievements was made during the French and the Czech presidency. And we had to conclude the key remaining files. So in the first half of this year, the Swedish presidency completed the negotiations on charging infrastructure throughout the EU, on more sustainable fuels in shipping, and on energy efficiency. And the last missing piece was the Renewable Energy Directive and the partly connected file on more sustainable fuels in the aviation sector, where the compromises reached with the European Parliament during the spring were approved by member states the other week. Thirdly, we have, together with our colleagues in the Council, made Europe a little freer. A free Europe is built on democracy, fundamental values, and the rule of law. And the Russian war in Ukraine demonstrate that the EU is and must be a solid alternative to non-democratic regimes. We constantly must safeguard the rule of law and live up to our own standards. And this is why we have maintained the pressure on the Article 7 procedures and continued with the country-specific discussions in the annual rule of law dialogue. And that is why I invited a broad group of stakeholders to Stockholm last week to participate in a symposium on democracy and rule of law. And we had a good discussion on where we are and what steps and measures can be taken to strengthen the rule of law. And I think the exchanges held triggered new ideas, and I think gave us also a new foundation for our endeavors and key issues. A culture characterized by democracy and the rule of law must be grown, and upholding is a continuing battle. And also let me take the opportunity to thank you once again, Göran, for doing a great job as moderating these discussions. But a freer Europe is also economically stronger. Over the last decades, Europe has, in economic terms, been outperformed by most of our competitors. And this is a fundamental problem for our prosperity and ability to generate the resources needed to tackle challenges such as climate change and rebuilding Ukraine. And that is why the Swedish presidency has made a long-term competitiveness our priority. We are quite happy with what we have achieved. The Commission picked up on our ideas on table strategy that puts the internal market, R&D, skills, access to private capital, and better regulation at the core. And the March European Council, this was endorsed by the leaders. And later this week, we expect them to commit to revert these issues regularly. That provides us with a solid base for making this strategy play out fully in the real world. As this is about changing our general course of direction, it will not be a quick fix. We need to get away from the crisis management and urgency-driven policies that we have gotten used to, and as a replacement, draw these right lessons on what to build our current wealth and adapt to today's world order. It is comforting that many member states, including the incoming presidency, are making plans for continuing this work. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, much has been done for a safer, greener, and freer EU. We have a week left now of intense negotiations, and our list of complete files is getting longer. But our engagement doesn't stop here. In the coming years, the EU has an enormous task to deal with to prepare for enlargement. That has been through the Russian attacks on Ukraine, the geopolitical dimension has been very important, and also the sense of urgency, and also, of course, for the Western Balkan countries. It is important that we all, both in politics and in other parts of society, actively and boldly seek answers on how the EU should meet all challenges related to this. And it was a pleasure for me to share, as chair of the General Council, to invite my colleagues to Stockholm last week for a first discussion on these issues. And my main takeaway from these discussions is first and foremost that the positive approach from all taken by all member states, namely that we must make this enlargement happen. And my second takeaway is that it confirmed that we must be careful not to plunge ourselves into general debates on major changes to the European cooperation, neither content nor in form. Any reforms will be difficult to manage, not to mention treaty reforms, which also will be extremely time-consuming. But adjusting to future enlargements is something that we have to do. And I'm glad that we could initiate these discussions during the Swedish presidency, and I'm sure that more deliberation will follow under the incoming trio. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Roswall. And the Minister will come back once the panel discussion has been going on for a little while. But I just wanted to, as a follow-up to your introductory remark, now looking back at these 6 months, is it something that has surprised you in particular, or where you have made, let's say, substantive moves forward that weren't really anticipated on your side? And taking the other perspective, something that has been much tougher than you expected it to be?
Thank you. I think it's been too little time for me to analyze yet. So I'm really looking back to come back maybe in August when I have some time to reflect, because the time has been intense. I think that I maybe didn't, as I said, the Swedish presidencies are well prepared. It was always also from the previous government and the new one I have 5 weeks to prepare in one way, but of course I was in opposition and I had the opportunity to have a good relation with Mr. Hans Dahlgren, who was previous EU minister. But the Swedish presidency was very well prepared, as I said, but everything is, and even for something that was not prepared, like the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. But still, there are things that happen during the way that we maybe didn't foresee, like the bumpy road when I talked about the Fit for 55. So, of course, things has been sometimes more difficult than I had supposed. But finally, we have, with a lot of work, have long nights and a lot of phone call, SMS, and very good co-workers here in Brussels has been working. But I think that is one of the things that I've been a little bit surprised of. But ask me again in August, and maybe I have another answer.
I will do so. I will do so. Thank you again, Jessika Roswall, and you can have a seat if you would like. And now I will welcome here the eminent panelists, Elisabeth Kuiper, Andreas Liljeheden, and Ignacio Molina. And now we have heard from the minister outlining her perspective on what has been happening over the last 6 months. And now it's great to have independent analysts and one journalist here with us to now come with the verdict. How has it really been? And we are going to do this in a form of conversation, but please also start indicating to me when you want to jump in and ask questions. But I would like to start by asking the panelists a relatively broad and open question from your perspective. How do you understand the work of the Swedish EU presidency? Do you want to start first, Elisabeth?
Well, happy to do so. Thanks, Göran. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that the Swedish presidency is a really interesting one to judge, because I got the same question also for the Czech presidency. So I remember that indeed 6 months ago, I asked myself the same question, like, well, what has the presidency achieved? And perhaps if you would have asked me 2-3 weeks ago, my answer would have been very different. I think I would have said that, the Swedish presidency did what it needed to do because, the presidency needs to be an honest broker. It needs to get on with files because that's the task of a presidency. But it's nothing more, nothing less. However, and I think the minister also hinted to it in her introduction, I think the last 3 weeks has seen a lot of progress. I mean, you mentioned the files, the quite historic achievement on the migration and asylum file, the European Media Freedom Act, where also there has been intense discussions and also an assessment of perhaps the lack of progress that the Swedes perhaps would have due to some skepticism at home. I think the example of the nature restoration law, where also there has been intense discussion, not to say emotional discussion, and again, where there were a lot of doubts about progress made. You mentioned competitiveness, and no doubt that we're going into that during the discussion. So again, I think my final verdict now, a week prior to the Spanish presidency, is much more positive actually than it would have been a few weeks ago. So I think I pause here and also perhaps hear the assessment of my co-Brussels.
Yes. Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that verdict. And Andreas, Liljeheden, you also follow, of course, the events here in Brussels all the time. What's your view?
Yes, I do. And I think I have to say I totally agree with Elizabeth. We had a podcast halftime into the presidency, and we said that, first of all, it was very difficult to judge halftime, and we'll see what will happen in the end. And I really agree that just like the Czech presidency, that the Swedish one put in a higher gear the last couple of weeks. So we see quite many, in terms of legislation, the Swedes have done a good job, I think, and passed many files. And like you say, with the immigration file, for instance, which was quite historic. So yes, also a good verdict from my side. Then you can also always talk about, I mean, what's been criticized has mainly been the sort of informal gatherings in Stockholm. And I guess we might touch upon that later on as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Andreas and Ignacio. I guess you follow it, but from a little bit more of a distance. But what's your view?
Well, Göran, last time we met was in Stockholm early May. And I fully agree with what Elizabeth and Andrea has said. And it's recorded that when we were trying to assess the Swedish presidency at that time, so I think it was early May, as compared with the expectation for the Spanish presidency, the idea was, well, this is basically a low-profile semester, very much focused on, well, the legislative files with no political, let's say, added message, no particular ambitions, even regarding the legislative process, as compared with Spain, that's supposed to be a presidency with. Now, it's true. It's absolutely true that in the last month, even if I'm not an expert in many technicalities of the files that have made progress in the last month, in the last weeks, I really think that the bottom line should be very, very different. Perhaps also because the expectation regarding the Spanish presidency are now much lower than were in early May. And what's very funny, when you talk with Spanish officials, that they tend to say, well, at the beginning of the year, well, you know, the Swedish, they have, well, not particularly pro-European government, now the new government, and they are going to do a good job, but very, very technical, very Brussels center. And of course, the Spanish presidency is going to be much more ambitious. It's going to be a golden presidency, because then the Belgians will have elections to the European Parliament, and they don't have, they won't have time to finish the dossier. So it's for Spain to close most of the dossier. Now this has changed dramatically. Now the idea for the Spanish officials is that, well, Sweden did a good job and not so technical, not so low profile, and of course, well, perhaps the Spanish is not going to be a golden presidency, and perhaps the Belgians has to finish the job. And now, as you know, with snap elections, we are going to lose at least 2 months, hopefully only 2 months. We don't have ham parliament, that hopefully we don't know yet, of course. So yes, that's my first point would be, yes, I fully agree. It's not just that the Swedish presidency should be judged positively. That was in the last weeks that changed dramatically the stat assessment.
Excellent. So positive accounts already at this stage from the panelists. Shall we maybe dive into some of the areas then that have been on the top of the agenda? As was outlined, we have security, of course, and the war in Ukraine. There is economy and competitiveness, the green files, and then the rule of law, etc. Shall we perhaps start then with what has been most pressing, of course, is the attempts to maintain the unity in the EU in relation to the ongoing situation in Ukraine, and also, in addition to that, as the minister raised at the end of her speech, of course, the process of enlargement restarting, it also has begun to ask a bit of questions to our European Union as we are today on how we should reform. So, Elisabeth, how do you think the Swedish presidency has performed in these tasks so far?
Well, also in Ukraine, it's true that, of course, previous presidency have been called crisis presidency. And I think you put it very well in your introduction. I think that also points to the fact that we can't continue calling presidencies crisis presidency because this is today's world. And you probably heard that here at the European Policy Center, we coined the term perma crisis, because again, this is recurring crisis going on at the same times, and that will not change anytime soon. We're rather in a wartime economy and in a context that will stay the same. So I think the question about EU unity is more important than ever, given the challenges. And I think we have seen a lot of EU unity from the past, but we're now at a stage where the question is, how does that concretely translate? And I think if you already compare the difference between the 10th sanctions package and the 11th sanction package, where the 11th sanction package that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and where people felt like, well, this is actually more about consolidating the previous package and enforcing it, and where you saw that a lot of economic interests were at stake, because we also see that bigger member states like Germany, they do have economic relations with Turkey and China. And again, enforcing and reinforcing the sanctions package would have consequences and has consequences for their trade with these countries. So I think it was very hard for the Swedish presidency, but I think they have done very well. And I think there's also examples to illustrate where they've tried to go the extra mile. For example, I heard that for the ECFIN Council that took place in April, if I'm not mistaken, that the Swedes also invited the Canadian Minister for Finance to see if they could also gain additional support, both economically as well as larger in terms of the longer term vision for how to deal with Ukraine and how to build on that future relationship with Ukraine. So again, I think it's very hard. And of course, also the developments in Russia, as we have seen this weekend, are very hard also to sort of assess. And then linking that back to how that links to the position of EU member states, that isn't always very straightforward. But EU unity will be harder also in terms of enlargement. We have seen also with the European political community that took place during the Czech presidency that, yes, there are intentions, but when intentions get translated in more concrete political achievements, it gets much harder. We know that at the end of the year, we should know more about Ukrainian accession and what that means for the concrete timetable. And that question is much harder than the more political support last year.
Indeed, and probably we'll get a hint already at the European Council later this week about these matters. Andreas, how do you understand the work of the Swedes when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, I think that one has to remember that when it comes to sanctions and also supporting Ukraine, it becomes more and more difficult. I think I hear that all the time here in Brussels, that you sort of took the decision with the low-hanging fruit in the beginning, and then as you proceed, it becomes more and more difficult. We've seen it in the when it comes to sanctions. The 10th package was in February, I think, and then now we have the 11th. So it took basically the whole presidency to agree on this. Also, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, I think it's becoming more and more difficult as well. If we look at I'm thinking about the free trade deal that was prolonged with Ukraine. There was a lot of problems where you had the neighboring countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, blocking that deal because they were overthrown with agricultural products from Ukraine. So I think that in that sense, the Swedish presidency has done quite a good job trying to navigate, but also with support from the Commission, because I think that some parts here, when it comes to sanctions, that's the Commission that is proposing, and also in part also negotiating. So it's I think they've done a fairly good job.
It's more of a teamwork when it comes to these external affairs issues, I guess. Ignacio, do you want to give your view?
Yeah, very, very fast on that. On this, well, unity, it's been very obvious success of the Swedish presidency, as it was with the Czechs and the French. So now the fear is that, as it has been said, it's probably going to be much more difficult to keep that unity, because, well, since February last year, what we have had basically is the unity against the brutal aggression of Russia. And it was, let's say, easier to, even if sanctions were remarkable, and some of them with a very obvious economic impact, but the idea of unity against Moscow and Putin was relatively easy to achieve. Now it's going to be much more difficult. After the events this weekend, we see that probably Russia, is much less powerful than we supposed, but was supposed to be, and probably the idea of some ceasefire, and when we will decide that the Russians has been failed in these aggressions is going to be very controversial. The Council, some member states will probably state that we need to keep the territorial integrity of Ukraine as before 2014. Others will defend that, well, if we restore the borders at last year's is enough. And this is going to be probably disagreements and dissent within the Council, and it's going to be much more difficult than for Spain sharing, well, the Foreign Affairs Council, as you know, well, it's not the Spaniard chairing the Foreign Affairs Council, but it's not just the Foreign Affairs Council. All the other councils may be discussing about, well, this absolute priority of unity. And so for Swedish presidency should be given the credit that the unity was preserved, even if it was much more difficult to, for example, to agree on the 11th package of sanctions. On enlargement, just a word. Well, this is one of the, and then this, the progress that has been made this semester has been remarkable. I visited Moldova and North Macedonia last month, and it was very obvious that there is a new momentum in regarding the enlargement dossier. And I would like to say that normally EU experts tend to criticize rotating presidencies after the Lisbon Treaty, useless, not particularly important, and probably we may agree on something. But when you look to the Spanish preparation of the semester and now see that Spain has to face the enlargement dossier, up to now the Spanish position towards enlargement was, well, we are theoretically in favor of enlargement, but we don't do anything in favor of enlargement. But now when you have to prepare the Council, the officials dealing with enlargement in Madrid are really, well, they have to reach consensus. They have to make a position of Spain. Now Spain is much more favorable to make progress in the Western Balkans and to give the status of candidate and start accession negotiation for Ukraine or Moldova. This is something that in the absence of the presidency, of the rotating presidency, would be much more difficult. So this idea that you have to chair the Council, the General Affairs Council, that you have to reach compromise and consensus among the 27 is very powerful, also for the member states to make a more mature views about the different dossier and not hide in the comfort zone.
It's true. There's a real new dynamic in this field, and that can be probably felt in most capitals. And I would assume that this is something also that will be in a very important part for the EU discussions in the years to come. But I would like to now move on to some of the other fields or areas, and of course the economy is one of those important fields. The Swedish presidency has really tried to make a mark when it comes to favoring competitiveness and long-term growth. Sometimes we speak about the presidency as an agenda setter, and at least to my mind, this is one of the areas where the Swedish EU presidency has tried to make something of a mark. But on the other, at the same time, we know that the way in which the economy is evolving, and particularly the way in which several other important actors have been pursuing policies, notably the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, it has also meant a slight challenge to this agenda. But I still want to ask the panelists, how do you think when it comes to these matters and competitiveness and the long-term growth issues that the Swedish presidency has fared? Elisabeth?
That's a very interesting question, because indeed, at first sight, you would say that indeed Sweden had a very strong agenda when it comes to competitiveness. I think it was one of these priorities where in advance of the presidency, everyone was expecting Sweden, also given the national interest at stake, to be very strong. And also, indeed, the European Commission's vision on the European competitiveness beyond 2030, which was the title of that vision, was seen as being strongly pushed by the presidency. And that really also makes sense from a Swedish national perspective. It's all about the single markets, cutting red tape for businesses, reducing the EU's strategic dependencies. And I think we have seen, not just because of the Russian invasion with energy dependencies, but already since COVID-19, that of course, strategic independencies also can hamper the EU. And it's not just a question of economic growth like we saw perhaps before. So yes, there I'd say that Sweden has had a very strong agenda. However, here in Brussels, the assessment when it comes to the broader economic context and also the Stability and Growth Pact, where now the discussion is going on about economic governance reform, is actually one part of the equation where the Swedes are being seen as a bit more reluctant to make progress. And the reason could be, and I'm sure that Ignacio has a word to say about it, is that perhaps that means that they have their hands free once the Spanish presidencies take over. Because I think if you look at the different mentalities of European countries, I think it's no secret here in Brussels that oftentimes, and I hope I don't offend you, but I think you'd rather see it as a compliment, the Swedes are being seen as the frugals. And of course, if you're in the driving seat of the presidency, you can't perhaps be as frugal as one would wish for. And in that respect, perhaps having your hands free after the presidency to be stronger on the Stability and Growth Pact, on the deficits and debts, and the fact that we need to be strong even we're in a wartime economy, I think that is seen as part of the agenda where indeed the Swedes have just let go a little bit so that, again, they are a bit more free to speak later on.
Great. Andreas, not only is Swedes known to be frugal, but also very free trade, positive to free trade, the internal market, and all of these things. And now the current of the tide seems to be going in a slightly different direction. Has that posed a problem for the Swedes, do you think?
I think it could be a problem. But then we also, actually tomorrow, there will be a signing of the EU-New Zealand agreement. So that's also during, I think that's sort of positive for the Swedish presidency. But I think that if I start off with the EU response to the IRA, so the American subsidy, I think that put Sweden in quite a difficult situation in the beginning of the presidency, because the American subsidies, they are it's protectionism basically, and the question was, will the EU respond with the same tool? And I'm sure that the Swedish government didn't want to go in that direction, being supporter of free trade and everything. So I think it was a bit difficult for the government to navigate in this. But then, of course, they had on their own part the priority of more long-term competitiveness that sort of maybe balanced it out a bit during the presidency. And when it comes to long-term, and I think also that this was, all the presidencies, they always have different priorities, but the overall question is more or less decided before, because you sort of course, everyone has climate change on the agenda, etc. But this long-term competitiveness, there was really the Swedish priority. So that was the most important thing, I think, for the government. To me, they did. Okay, so the Commission put forward a strategy, and the issue was raised at the European Council among leaders. So something happened, but I find it a bit difficult to assess and evaluate this because we are talking about long-term competitiveness. What will really happen? What will be the result? So I see it more as let's say that Swedish presidency planted a seed, and we see how it grows.
Let's see if hopefully the long-term growth is there also for the seed. And let's see, Ignacio, maybe from the Spanish point of view, which I guess to some extent would overlap with let's say more of a Swedish Northern European style when it comes to European economic policy areas, but also there might be some differences, right?
Well, Elizabeth mentioned that perhaps, well, on Sweden has, I wouldn't say that to be frugal is the problem of Sweden for being more proactive in this area, but rather not to be member of the Eurozone. For example, in regarding the discussion about fiscal rules, stability pact, and because, well, it's Spain and Netherlands is a prominent frugal member states, signed a non-paper last year with ideas that probably, if when you have Spain and Netherlands who agree on fiscal rules and the future of the Eurozone, probably there is basically the consensus among member state member of the Eurozone there. And probably it's true that we will have some positive results in the second semester of this year. It has to do also with the German coalition disagreement, but probably we will have it. And it's more difficult for Sweden to lead on that today. It's not part of the euro group, for example. But regarding the more general dimension of competitiveness and long-term growth, of course, Sweden has a reputation, and the agenda for this semester was very ambitious and also connected to the impact of the war. So it was short-term, long-term. It's true that now this is also very much connected to geopolitics, much more than used to be in the past. Last week, the Commission and the European External Action Service published the European strategic European economic security strategy. So and this idea of how to combine economic security and openness and competitiveness is also probably is going to be one of the most important priorities of the Spanish presidency, with this idea of open strategic autonomy. By the way, another non-paper with the Dutch 2 years ago on this issue is try to make this consensus between the French view of a strategic autonomy and more open. Spain is also a member state which is pro-free trade and supporting, for example, ratification of trade agreement with Mercosur. So there's a very interesting connection between this Swedish priority of competitiveness and open strategic autonomy. Will be the topic for the informal summit of the 27th to be held in early October in Spain. So I think that that's interesting that you can also be a leader of how to improve competitiveness on the internal market, even if you are not part of the euro.
Thank you so much. And of course, these will be dominating issues also in the future, and particularly in view of the European policy towards China, for instance, that is currently underway, developing. Now, perhaps we should move slightly faster over the last two areas that I wanted us to cover, and that's, of course, the Fit for 55. You all touched upon it already, and it has been advancing. It's one of those areas that was mentioned by Andreas that any presidency normally would need to take charge of, as there was such a big legislative package. But how then have the Swedes fared when doing this, Elisabeth?
You need to ask this question in the context of the, let's say, point in time we're in, because I think it's very relevant always to see when a presidency comes in. And clearly, the Swedish presidency comes in at a point in time where almost at the end of the current mandate of the European Commission. So I think for me also the question is to what extent the Swedes had a lot of choice to make progress. Because it's true, I mean, they have concluded 5 files under the Fit for 5 package: is the emissions trading system, the shipping regulation, aviation directive, the social climate fund, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And these are all big files. But of course, negotiations have been going on for a long time. And again, also based on what you said before, if now the Swedes, didn't come to agreement, what would it have meant for the Spanish and for the Belgians? It's already too late to close the file. So I think there was also a big push from member states to really make progress, because again, if progress was not made now, then these files would not be concluded before the end of the current mandate of the Commission. And I think that would have been seen as a no-go, because again, already in 2019 in December, when President von der Leyen came in and announced that the Green Deal would be her big ticket item, I think everyone felt indeed that there was urgency behind, a lot of urgency. And I think only with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we have seen that the urgency become also very political. So again, lack of progress was just no-go. So in that respect, I think the Swedish presidency didn't have a choice basically to make progress.
And they did. And Andreas, maybe this is the point in time where we also think a little bit about the domestic political conditions, something that, of course, at least here in Brussels, has stirred lots of interest in the fact that there was a relatively new government in office in Sweden, a minority government that has the support and support structure with the Sweden Democrats, and particularly on the green files, let's say, as we know that one or two of these have resulted with Sweden not actually supporting the presidency proposal. How should one understand this? Let's say, is there a connection between domestic politics then and the task of the presidency as the honest broker? Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I think so. No, I agree, Göran. But also, just to start off with the Fit for 55, because what you mentioned is not really part of the Fit for 55 package. But I think that when it comes to the package, like you said, Elizabeth, the Czechs, they already sort of passed roughly half of the package before the presidency started. The Swedes, they did the rest, except for one file, which is on energy taxation. I think that's part of the Fit for 55, and that's taxation. It's really difficult. It was a no-go. It was impossible. No one expected that anyway. So the Swedes did what they were supposed to do. But then what you mentioned is really interesting about there are two files related to nature, which both has to do with forestry, where the Swedish government, the Swedish presidency, put forward proposals for a decision in the council, and the Swedish government didn't support the actual compromise, which is, I've been here in Brussels for 15 years. I have to say this is really unusual. And the two files, maybe I should just mention it. It was the LULUCF, which is about carbon sinks in the forest, where Sweden abstained. That was actually negotiated by the Czechs, but still, Sweden put forward the decision put the decision on the agenda, abstained. And then the nature restoration law, which was the government went even further. This was negotiated by the Swedish presidency, put forward on the agenda. The Swedish presidency wanted a decision at the council, and this was last week. But the government voted no, and they are against it. And that has to do because as soon as it has to do with forestry in Sweden, we tend to think that's a national politics.
We have too much of it.
Yes, it's not something that the EU should mess with. And especially if I look at the government with support from the Sverigedemokraterna, the Swedish Democrats, they are really of the opinion that this is a Swedish issue. So I guess that played a role. But also during this meeting, one also has to say that to make it even more complex, the actual minister, she was from the Liberal Party, and her party supported the file. So I guess that maybe her personally wanted to support it.
It's not only EU politics that can be complicated. Swedish can be occasionally as well. On the green files, Ignacio, so the Spaniards, they can relax now. It's all done.
Well, it's very interesting, your question about domestic implication of the climate and energy files. Because when people wonder what would happen in case that after the elections we have a different government, different political color, conservative government instead of the socialist, and probably energy, climate, environment would be the dossier in which, particularly because of Vox, the populist right-wing party probably will make confidence and supply to PP government in case they win the elections. Probably they're going to make emphasis on not going forward on those issues. When you look to the coalitions that they are now, we had local elections 2 weeks ago, and now, or 3 weeks ago, and now the new municipalities that are being formed with many coalitions, PP, Vox, and it's very obvious that environmental issues, traffic restrictions is very important for Vox because of the nature of the voters, and then it has to do with farmers, hunting, people who want to go by car to the so. And the Socialist Party has a very high emphasis on energy and climate change. Because of that, it's the Spanish government is very lucky that the Swedish has made progress on that. First, because in case the socialists stayed in office, they, as honest broker, they would prefer not to not to have as priority climate change because the Spanish views are very strong. You are a honest broker, you can take advantage of the semester, and probably because you will fail if you try to. So probably even if the socialists are in office, they would prefer not to have climate change issues as a priority. And in case that PP is in government, would be probably an awkward situation in which Vox is going to ask, because for them, they are not Eurosceptic, Vox, but they are very critical of Agenda 2030 and climate change policies. So that's why I think that the good result during this presidency, even if there has been nothing extraordinary, but the idea of having many files in progress is going to be positive for the next semester.
Great. Elizabeth and then Andreas.
Yeah, we may perhaps be going to speak about the same point, because speaking about national dynamics, what I'm really interested in is a file that we haven't really been discussing, is the migration file. Because I really vividly remember that just before Sweden took over, of course, there was a change in government. And given the importance of reaching an agreement on migration, a lot of voices in Brussels were really wondering out loud, what is going to happen now that there is indeed, let's say, governance with a different political color? And again, the fact that there has been agreement, and it's really seen as a rather historic agreement after 7 years of ongoing negotiations. So this is really important. So I'm actually wondering, so perhaps I'm sort of passing the question to you, like, has that led to a lot of discussion at national level? Because I can only imagine that, especially that file, because it's always very sensitive. And I think especially given current context, it's more sensitive than ever. So has that actually led, even in Sweden, where I think I always, because I've been working at council for 4 years, and I always saw the Swedes as somehow reluctant Europeans that never get very warm when it comes to the EU. So I can only imagine that this must have led to a lot of discussion back home.
Yeah. Was it this question you wanted to?
No, actually, I was one, but I can take that question as well. But I was just wanting to add about the with the Spaniards taking over the presidency and the climate files, the nature restoration law that I talked about before. When the decision was made in the council, there was a public debate. So you can follow it live. So each and every minister took to the podium and spoke, and it was the last minister who was the Spanish one. And if she wouldn't have said yes to the nature restoration law, they wouldn't have taken the decision. They wouldn't have had the qualified majority necessary. So in that file, that wouldn't have been taken with the PP and Vox, I think.
But then great on that you brought up migration, because I wanted to come back to this, as you all mentioned this as one of the main achievements. And I guess just a little bit the background. There are lots of Swedes involved here. There is the commissioner who has put the proposal, and of course there's also in European Parliament the rapporteur who is also a Swede from the EPP group. And just to the background on this, when Parliament agreed to its position, there was some disturbing reflections in the Swedish context, particularly then from the supporting party, the Sweden Democrats, who didn't agree with what European Parliament had come to as a conclusion. However, the council is a different story. And now I pass to you, Andreas.
Yes, I think that you need to really make that distinction, because in the council there is no relocation mechanism that is an obligation. So that is the main difference. In the Parliament position, you do have well, it's actually a separate legislation, but you still have these the relocation mechanism. So I guess that is also why it was easier in the council. I wouldn't say easy in the council to take the decision, because it's like you said, it's been very very difficult. But from a Swedish context, a national one, I think it was easier for the government, and also with support from the Swedish Democrats, to say yes to the council position than to the parliament.
And it's also worth noting that there's a shift in policy from the Swedish government, the previous one having pushed solidarity a lot over many years, as you may have noticed when you worked in the council, and the new government that is not at all pushing that direction. And that's it's a simplified version. Now I'm going to start letting in questions and answer, and I will ask the minister back. But before that, I will turn back if there is anything additional that we have missed, or something that stands out on the Swedish EU presidency that you think you really want to put emphasis on at this stage. Elizabeth, you have something.
Well, perhaps a very different file that people perhaps have have not thought of when it comes to progress during the Swedish presidency. It's the agreement on the Istanbul Convention. And I find this a very important file to mention because it's really about the fight against violence against women. And also there, after, again, 7 years of ongoing negotiations and a lot of countries, especially your Eastern European countries that were, threatening to block the agreement, the Swedish presidency, I believe it was last week, has achieved a vote on this file. And I think, again, in itself, that's an important symbol, but I think it's also important for the ongoing discussions on the directive at European level that's being negotiated. It's been presented, I believe, last year. And I think that the agreement now on the Istanbul Convention is hopefully a big push for also this file to be concluded. So again, it's not something that would figure high perhaps in the news, but I think it is important to mention.
Yes, the point that Istanbul Convention was agreed and the relocation mechanism on refugees was very positive for Sweden, particularly when you realize that Hungary or Poland are against. So this fear at the beginning of the semester that because of Sweden Democrats having so influence in the government was going to be a skeptic, reluctant presidency regarding those issues, and the fact that there were agreement on that was judged very positively, at least in the Spanish press and the Spanish pundits.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I should just, since I did touch upon this in the beginning, about maybe the criticism of the Swedish presidency, which if I listen to my journalist colleagues, for instance, it's been a lot about the meetings in Stockholm, which takes place not in Stockholm, but by the airport, Arlanda, where you, at least the journalists, they sit in a sort of a garage for planes, like a bunker above ground, but still with no windows. And if you compare to the Spanish presidency, they have the informal meetings just last week I booked 2 trips for the presidency, one to Granada, one in Toledo, and there you have the meetings all over the country, even in Canary Islands and then Mallorca. Where the Swedes stay, well, they stuck to the airport.
We're not only frugal when it comes to the EU budget,
yeah,
but,
exactly.
but in every aspect of it.
But I think that also one has to say that if the Swedes would have done the opposite, to have the meetings in a castle or in central Stockholm, and they block the whole city or half the city, and it will cost much more, then it would be criticized because of that. So there are pros and cons.
It is.
But perhaps really briefly, because of course we want to listen to you as well. Yes, I mean, I've heard these stories and I think we can all make jokes of it because it made me smile as well when I saw these rather frugal pictures. But more seriously, what I found interesting, I think more worrying, is that actually at national level, the Swedish presidency hasn't done a lot to also translate the message about the importance of the EU. And I think that is much more important than, the venue for the presidency. Because after all, we are in a point in time where also the support for Ukraine is needed at national level. And again, if you think about the outpour of sympathy at the very start of the Russian invasion, that was the relatively easy part. But now again, in the context of a cost of living crisis, energy dependency, where people feel it at home. And I think there it's a really missed opportunity that the Swedish presidency didn't perhaps work harder to also translate that message back home. And I think that is the important point here.
I think that kind of perspective is echoed among many Swedish commentators as well when it comes to this, of course, important issue. Now, at this point, I'm very happy to welcome back Jessika Roswall to sit right here next to me. And I'm also very interested to hear your questions and comments. And so you please just raise your hand and I will distribute to you. But before that, I take the opportunity to hand back to you, Jessika, because I know you have written down a lot of things here. Is there anything in particular which you would like to comment or reflect on?
Thank you, Göran, and thank you for all your comments. No, I agree with almost everything. Just one thing that I would like to say when it comes to Swedes being reluctant towards EU, I would just want to say that yes, that is one of my goals, of course, for the coming years, to make make everybody more talking more about EU affairs. But I also want to remind everybody that in Sweden we have a huge, I don't remember, it's 68% of Swedes who really are pro-EU, and that I think we sometimes tend to forget because Swedes really like EU, and we realize that the problems that we challenge that we have coming up is nothing that we can solve by ourselves. That was maybe one of the conflicts. And then I have, of course, a lot of comments, but I will take them in. I will rather.
Are you sure? Okay. No, it's true that at least when it comes to public opinion, there's been a gradual and a quite dramatic shift, actually. Now, I'm going to look at your hands waving. Before that, we have one question that comes from the online audience, and I will read it out loud. It's to everyone, but especially for Ignacio. How do you think that the change of government in Spain would affect the negotiations related to the Pact on Migration and Asylum? Do you want to go?
Well, interestingly, contrary to what I said about climate change, migration is not particularly high on the agenda in Spain, and not particularly relevant for the Conservative Party, and particularly even for Vox. Well, Vox, of course, is a party who is not favorable to, who is asking for much more strict policy of the borders, and has a discourse on migration that you can imagine. But migration is not very salient right now in Spain, probably because when you look to the route of immigrants, well, there is a Greek and an Italian route, but not the Spanish one, perhaps because of good cooperation with Morocco, that is connected, by the way, to another controversial issues about the change of policy of Spain regarding Western Sahara, but this is another story. And then there is, the truth is that there is right now a need of workforce in Spain. So particularly when you look to the where we have the economy in which, as you know, is very important, the services connected to tourism, and there is shortage of the need of workforce, even if you think that the Spanish figure for unemployment is very high. So migration, now we have elections, migration is not at all high on the manifesto of Vox. They are thinking about other issues such as, well, national identity, hunting, bullfighting, and other interesting things, but not on migration, very, very interestingly. And for PP, they are not interested at all on politicizing migration, because if they do that, it's going to be much better for Vox than for PP. So that's why I think that on migration, there will be no change, even if we have a different political color after the elections.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to jump in on the specific issue? Or if I may, allow me to broaden it a little bit. So we all have seemed to agree that this is a major achievement of the Swedish presidency to come up with a council qualified majority. But looking ahead, of course, we need to see the negotiations between council and European Parliament. And of course, with what seems to be somewhat fragile qualified majority in the council, what do you see when it comes to the migration pact in the future, Andreas?
I think there will be certainly difficult talks between the parliament and the council, no matter who is in the driving seat in the council. I think, and especially on the issue of relocation and solidarity and support for among member states. And yeah, that's the main point, I think.
Lisa.
I think especially if you think about the fact that after EU elections, we will have Hungary and Poland in the driving seat. And also here in Brussels, there's a lot of discussion to start with about whether or not actually Hungary should have the presidency. There's different opinions. I think the parliament has expressed itself very clearly by saying that actually Hungary should not be in the driving seat. Again, I also hear, I think, more sort of realpolitik voices that say, well, they will have the presidency, they are preparing for it, and probably they will just have it. Perhaps they cannot deal with certain files affecting the rule of law. And perhaps migration is also one of these files where you wonder whether it's not better to take the Hungarians off that file. But that's just a question for discussion. Because I think with these countries driving the discussion will not get easier.
can just add one thing. I mean, when you on migration, the decision in the council was taken by qualified majority, and that was also the problem a couple of years ago when they took the decision on the temporary relocation mechanism, where they overruled Poland and Hungary, and they simply said no, we will not. We will not do this. They refused to follow the decision that was taken by qualified majority. So what will happen now? Will they actually?
They already challenged us as well this decision to Minister Roswall. Of course, this has been one important step from the Swedish presidency. But how worried are you about the future of this policy field?
I've been also. You asked me what I didn't foresee, and I didn't maybe foresee how much time I have to spend in Strasbourg during this half a year. So I had on every session had a discussion, a debate on migration, and I see that in this short time period it's been changing, and more different party groups has been more coming to more or less the same sense of urgency and this momentum in this question also. And I think it's a lot of things that matters in this, but I think that this momentum and this sense of urgency is amongst both the Council and the European Parliament, and that gives a good push to coming to an agreement. But of course we see we all need to make efforts moving forward, but I feel it's been moving.
Indeed. Now, do we have questions or comments from the audience? So there will be a microphone, and if you could state your name and affiliation, we take gentleman over there and then lady here.
My name is Han Vos. I have been for 35 years a European Council of Ministers official and have been dealing with justice and home affairs from the beginning. And I even may have been a part responsible for the Dublin Convention. So don't blame me, But apart from that, I would like to hear especially to the Mr. Minister, how do you see the interplay or your experience between the Commission, the Council, of course, a little bit the Council Secretariat and the European Parliament? Has it been cumbersome or has it been very flexible? How is your experience and what would you advise?
Excellent question. Typically here for Brussels question, Minister Roswall, let's say institutional interplay between Council and Presidency and the Commission and the European Parliament.
So I have not been in the Brussels bubble for so long time, maybe, so I don't have anything to compare it with. So from my perspective, things have worked very smoothly. And I think one analysis that I already have done, it's good that it is this rotating presidencies, because I have learned how important it is to have a very good connection with the European Parliament. And that is something, because to succeed also when it comes to trilogues and so forth, it's you have to know the dynamic in the Parliament. Of course, as a minister, I can learn the dynamic within the Council. And when it comes to also the Commission and the Secretariat, the Council Secretary, I think everything is very well functioning, and that is also my answer when I get questions about Spanish Presidency. How will it work? They're going to have election. I was like, we have a system. In Sweden, we say we have a system, but European Union's institutions also have system for things to work out. So I'm quite impressed of how the things are working out, and
Good to hear. We have one more question here. Just hang on for the microphone. Is
this working? Yeah, okay. Hi, Agnieszka Widłaszewska from the European Commission. One topic that hasn't really been brought up so much today is the Eastern Partnership. So my question is about that. Of course, Sweden was instrumental in creating the Eastern Partnership to begin with in 2009. And due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, in light of the fact that Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova applied for EU membership, we are in a period of reflection, I suppose, on the Eastern Partnership, what it's supposed to be. How is it supposed to continue as it was, or is it supposed to be reformed somehow? And I'm wondering, because I know that for Sweden, this was somewhat a priority as well, to maybe figure out these new formats of cooperation with these countries. And I was wondering, particularly the question is for the minister, but in case other speakers have any thoughts as well, how do you evaluate this? Has there been any progress on this? Do we have any specific idea on what to do about the Eastern Partnership, or what should maybe future presidencies do in that respect? Thank you.
Thank you so much for an interesting and I guess also a little bit tricky question.
Yes, a little bit tricky in one way. I think that as I ended my intervention in the start, that we have a new, also momentum is the right word for when it comes to enlargement, that is also including Eastern Partnership, I would say. And that for me, it's been important to also to have this high on the agenda. And that is one of the reasons why I traveled to Western Balkans, and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Tobias Billström, has been doing that. And I think it is important that, and I feel I hear from all the member states that we all see the urgency in this question, in this endorsement, on a broader perspective, maybe. And that is also the reason why I think we now also have to discuss on our EU's internal absorption ability. And so it's very much different questions. But I think the discussion in these topics, both when it comes to Eastern Partnership and the enlargement and global and so forth, has been higher on the agenda. Is a lot of talk and discussions about it. And I think that is very needed and timely and urgent.
Over to the panelists. Ignacio, you want to?
Now, on Eastern Partnership or the Eastern dimension of neighborhood policy, as I mentioned, there has been a very obvious change in mentality of Spanish officials regarding enlargement, that now they realize this momentum for making real progress and perhaps a realistic calendar regarding enlargement in Western Balkans and a calendar for negotiation with honest and realistic negotiation with Moldova or Ukraine, perhaps Georgia. But this is connected, the Spanish point of view, with the southern dimension of the neighborhood. If the eastern neighbors are no longer neighbors but candidates, you have to pay attention to the south. You know, there's this idea of having perhaps a summit or a meeting with either southern Mediterranean countries or Arab countries during the second half of the year. Well, this is Charles Michel and the European Council task. It's not Spain to organize that meeting, but this idea that well, we have to take into it. It's this a quid pro quo, no? That yes, it's obvious that we have to make progress regarding take seriously enlargement dossier, but the 27 has to take seriously southern dimension of neighborhood too.
Thank you so much. Did anyone else want to? Andreas?
Yeah, maybe about the Eastern Partnership, this is more of a reflection. I don't really have an answer, but I'm wondering, I mean, now we have also the EPC, so the European Political Community, which is much broader gathering.
Which is an acronym in this house.
Oh, yes,
not very popular, but
of course, yeah.
Be cautious.
Yes.
We call it the EPOC.
EPOC. Okay, let's call it EPOC then. In any case, you have the other gathering of much broader sphere of countries, and I'm wondering what place will the Eastern Partnership have in this. But then also on enlargement in general, I think that of course we are waiting for the evaluation from the Commission, and maybe these countries, Ukraine, Moldova, can start the negotiations. But if we are talking about real entering the EU and real enlargement, it's I don't want to be skeptical, but it's going to be very, very difficult. Okay, maybe Moldova, it's a small country, the EU can absorb it quite easily, but with Ukraine, that's a huge country with a huge agricultural sector. And just if I could come back to the grain deal and the free trade deal between Ukraine and the EU, this was just a free trade deal, and also you see the neighboring countries, how sensitive it was. Even Poland, which is maybe the most pro-Ukrainian country we have in the EU, they blocked the trade with Ukraine. So imagine if we have Ukraine as a member, what will happen with the agricultural policy?
And this is part of what the minister mentioned. This was the informal General Affairs Council meeting just before midsummer that had an initial discussion about this. And my hunch is that this will be one of the big issues on the common EU agenda in the future, both enlargement and how the EU then should adopt. Now, this is the moment where I have to conclude this very highly stimulating discussion in the room, and also for those of you following us online. It's been great privilege. Thank you, Elisabeth Kuiper, Andreas Liljeheden, Ignacio Molina, and of course, the Minister for EU Affairs, Jessika Roswall. And you are now kindly invited to a light lunch to which you will be directed. Thank you so much.